So, thanks, Monica. Hello, everybody. Yes, good that we had some energetic music to start that session, because that's kind of tough and difficult topic, because it's about the legal framework of what we're going to do. Camille has presented the big picture, and now I'm going to try and say how this will translate into your designing the program for CLLD and designing the national rules for flags, comparing what was the case in 2014-2020 and what is going to be the new MFAF. So I am going to mention a number of different aspects of the legislation. First of all, how detailed it is, what are the objectives envisaged, how the areas are defined in the next period, the composition of partnerships, the tasks of the LAGs and flags, some financing arrangements, the time frame, and the issue of multi-funding. That the last two topics Camille has already mentioned in her presentation, so maybe I don't have to go into that much detail. So basically, for the legislation, as Camille said, that this period is much simpler and much less developed. And even in the, let's say, number of pages, number of articles, we can see that in the EMFF, there was quite a sizable description of Union Priority 4, what it covers. You had all these articles about the focus of local development strategies, what was the eligible support, the 5 types of operations that you are reporting in Infosys, and the separate section on cooperation activities. Then there was, of course, the description of CLLD in the CPR, and also in the programs, what was called the operational programs. The managing authorities were expected to provide quite a lot of detail about how CLLD will be implemented. You had to say what the criteria would be for selection of flags, what would be the delivery arrangements, what about national networks, and so on. That has been significantly simplified and reduced in size. Basically, there are only 2 articles in the MFAF, draft MFAF regulation, keeping in mind, as Camille already said, we're still talking about drafts and not the actual legal acts, which are not finalized yet. So there is this very broad description of MFAF in the regulation. There's still 4 articles in the draft CPR, but they are much shorter. So, and there's less detail, less information about them. And also you in the national programs, you are not going to have to provide so much detail. So much more will be left to the national legislation and the national rules later on. For objectives, as you remember in the MFF, or not in the MFF, in the whole EU funding framework for 2014-2020, there were 9 thematic objectives, and CLLD was programmed differently under thematic objective 8 for employment or thematic objective 9 for social inclusion. For example, in the MFF, it was mainly about job creation. In LEADER, for example, in the rural development, it was more about social inclusion. Although in reality, there were not that much big differences. So that the choice of the thematic objectives didn't really matter very much. And you had also the objective for Union Priority 4 defined in the MFF regulation, which was increasing employment and territorial cohesion. And then there was a specific objective, also one specific objective, as Camille said, is going to be now, promotion of economic growth. But it's one specific objective with quite a lot of elements. So economic growth, social inclusion, job creation, support to employability and labor mobility. This is now reduced. There are only 5 thematic objectives. And as Camille said, in the MFAF, CLLD is focused on thematic objective 5, which is Europe closer to citizens. So, strangely enough, this is not the case for all the funds. And for example, under the European Social Fund, ESF+, it will not be thematic objective 5, but it will be the objective of social innovation, which will be under which CLLD would be programmed. But again, the types of things that can be funded will be probably very much the same. And for the objectives in MFAF, as Camille mentioned, enabling a sustainable blue economy in coastal island and inland areas, so just more specific on the areas that are covered, and the development of fishing and aquaculture communities. So the communities and areas are still at the heart in the MFAF. As you remember, you had to report for each project, for each operation funded under EMFF, CLLD, whether it is contributing to adding value, diversification, environment, social cultural objectives, and governance. So these were the 5 key categories, or what they were called actually objectives in the EMFF. What the operations would belong to. And then there was this famous Article 63.2, which said that support can also include measures provided for in other chapters of the EMFF regulation, and then it was necessary to follow the relevant conditions and the scales of contribution. That created some misunderstandings, a lot of difficulties for some managing authorities who didn't really know if we do diversification or innovation, whether we should be looking at Article 63.1 or we should be looking also at Article 29 or 30 of the MFF. So in this period that we're entering now, there is much broader definition that just says that CLLD should ensure that communities better exploit the opportunities offered by sustainable blue economy, which is very broad and can cover any of these: adding value, diversification, environment, social, cultural, anything that was covered before. And there is also a phrase that makes it clear that we're not just thinking about fisheries and aquaculture funding, but we can also cover broader diversification. So still possible to do tourism or other things that are not directly linked to fisheries and aquaculture. Fortunately, there's no equivalent provision as to Article 63.2, so there's no longer this need to worry or to ask questions, as I know many member states have been asking to DG Mare. How do we understand this provision, and what do we really have to do about fishing tourism or innovation projects? So there is no longer that overlap between CLLD and other activities described elsewhere in the MFAF regulation. For definition of areas, again, there was quite a specific population limit and limit of the specific sub-regional areas between 10,000 and 150,000 inhabitants. And there was also a definition in the MFF section or article on definitions, which said what we mean by the fisheries and aquaculture area. Now that is less restrictive. There's no population limit in the draft CPR currently, so there were a lot of questions if we can reach out bigger areas. Of course, if it makes sense and if it's probably has to be considered within the whole program logic. But at least there's no legislation that gives you a limit for population. Also, no definition of fisheries and aquaculture areas. On the other hand, there is a definition of sustainable blue economy, which again is very broad, but there is a definition under the definitions article. So all sector or cross-sector activities related to ocean, seas, coast, inland waters, emerging sectors, non-market goods, so not just business projects, but also the soft projects, environmental, social, economic. So the sustainability is also understood in a very broad sense. So there is some guidance, but there's not such a much detail in terms of what it should be covering, what should be covered under CLLD. In the previous period, and in both the MFF and the CPR, there were quite a lot of rules about what a partnership, what a local partnership should be composed of. In the MFF specifically, there was the idea to maximize the participation of fishery and aquaculture sectors, so that indicated already who should be definitely included in the partnerships. In the CPR, it said that representatives of public as well as private socioeconomic interests, and there was a very, very strict rule that neither public authorities nor any other single interest group should have more than 49% of the voting power on the partnership. There's no provision specifically to include fisheries and aquaculture sector. I imagine that most member states will still want to continue that, and most flags will definitely want to include representatives of fishery and aquaculture sectors. And in the draft CPR, there's no 49% limit, but it says that no single interest group should control the decision making, which is equivalent, but it's slightly less precise. Then again, in the CPR, in the previous period, there was a very long list of what the LAGs should do, and it was mandatory in the sense that it said that LAG tasks shall include a certain number of activities, building capacity, drawing up the selection procedure and criteria. Of course, there was an earlier specification that LAGs are actually responsible for developing the local strategies, but it was not explicitly mentioned. But ensure that the projects are coherent with the local strategy, and prepare and publish calls, receive applications, select operations, fix the amount of support, monitor and carry out evaluation. There was an exception though. So LAGs should select projects and fix the amount of support, but if it was a cooperation projects between several LAGs, then there was a possibility for the selection of these projects to be reserved at the MA level. Now, that is slightly changed now for the flag tasks. One very important element to keep in mind that currently the wording is LAGs shall exclusively carry out all of the following tasks. So there's no longer the possibility for managing authorities or intermediate bodies to be involved in the tasks that are specifically reserved for the LAGs, and that means for the flags, of course. So the building of capacity of local actors, definitely. The selection procedure and criteria that have to be decided and drawn at the LAG level. The preparation and publication of calls, the selection of operations and fixing the amount of support, as well as monitoring and evaluation, of course. So these tasks are exclusively reserved for the flags, and the same goes for cooperation projects, which again will be entirely within the decision of the flag. There will no longer be the possibility for managing authorities to organize calls for cooperation projects or for other projects implemented by the flags themselves. That is the current proposal of the CPR. For financing arrangements, that was, again, something quite carefully considered and discussed in the last period. There was this 10% top-up compared to the 75% EU contribution, so 25% of national public contribution at the national or the regional level, depending on the member state. This was for CLLD, it was 10% more from the EU. That was some kind of incentive from the EU side for member states to allocate a lot of funding to CLLD. And the possibility for higher aid intensity and specific provisions for advance payments also mentioned in the EMFF regulation. Currently, no equivalent incentive for CLLD under the NFAF. So there's a standard co-financing rate, which is a maximum rate. Member states can always add more funding if they want, and of course, depending on the national possibility or capacity. There's still the same rules about higher age intensity, basically for CLLD projects, if they are either publicly available results or collective activities, etc., they can be financed up to 100%. However, there are no provisions for advance payments, not explicitly mentioned. For comparison, under the EAFRD in the rural development, there are the possibility of having advance payments both for flags and and beneficiaries are explicitly mentioned in the rural development regulation. For the time frame, as you remember, there was the 2-year limit from the date of the approval of the partnership to launch finalize the first round of selection of strategies. So to have the first flag selected within 2 years, the partnership agreement, but not later. No flags could be selected after 31st December 2017 as a rule. This has been revised. First of all, it's linked not with the partnership agreement, but with the program. Secondly, it's shortened. The period is only 12 months, assuming that by now all the managing authorities have experience with selecting flags and setting them up. The important difference is that it's not the flags will just be selected, but they actually have to be able to fulfill their tasks. So they should be operational within 12 months and not just selected. And finally, the multi-funding, as has been mentioned, there were the 4 funds that were covered by common rules. There was an emphasis on coordination still that was mentioned, and the possibility of lead fund only meant at that time that there must be one fund that covered the preparatory support and running and animation costs. Now, this is slightly different. EAFRD is no longer under the common rules, but the CLLD provisions from the CPR do apply to leader lads. There's a big delay, of course, with the EAFRD, so there's a 2-year transition period, so that again has an impact on multi-funding possibilities, as we discussed before the break. The choice of funds is slightly different. We have also the Just Transition Fund that can have CLLD, at least in the draft proposal. And there's a new understanding of the lead fund, but you can still do the same idea as was called the lead fund in the previous period. So just one fund covering the preparatory support, running cost and animation. You can do multi-funding without any kind of lead fund, or you can go for the full option with the lead fund to have one set of implementation rules, although eligibility rules have to be still fund specific. So that's just a last reminder that these are provisional. This is not yet finalized, although to a large extent already agreed. And I'd be happy to answer questions or go into discussion. Thanks a lot.